different approach to the presentation. Rather than showing you how I use Photoshop, I thought I would share with you the process I go through as I either look for images or then what I think about as I make the images in Photoshop. So with that in mind, let's dive in. The first thing to look at are some paintings. I happen to be a big fan of an artist by the name of George Inness. He lived up and around here 200 years ago, and his specialization was landscape. Most of his work, I have a few pieces that I'll share with you tonight. Most of his work was not detailed, specific, straight line, crisp as a knife edge. It was soft. It was suggestive. As you can see, those white blobs in the lower left corner.
Little sheep.
They're sheep, but they're kind of not quite. I mean, obviously this is a person, but if I were to get close, it's only kind of a person. It's to suggest that a person was there.
That's pretty typical of oil painting.
Yeah. Well, he specialized in this particular style. I mean, even his skies, very soft. Yeah. Now, so I'd read up on him. Excuse me. I'd read up on him and watched, looked at quite a few of his pictures, studied them to a degree. And I found that the more I looked at them, the more I really enjoyed that style of painting rather than photorealism, if you will. So I kept on just looking and just going through. This one, I love the tonality that he used. I love the way he laid down the colors. His skies were always magnificent. They really took on a life of their own. And this is called Moonrise, this particular piece. And it's just lovely. Even the reflection down here in that little bit of water. But again, though the image is dark, were I to get close, there's no real good definable detail in the landscape, okay? And I like that. And I find that to be, for me, to be a reference point as I work on my imagery. Another one, this is a beautiful landscape, I think on the east side of the state. I think it's in Medford, Massachusetts. That sunset, this one is an evening scene. It's a sunset. And once again, his skies were magnificent. He had a tremendous following. He was an artist who was successful during his life because of the way he represented, not specifically, but suggested what was taking place in the scene in front of him. And he was active. He lived in Montclair, New Jersey for a while. He lived in Massachusetts for a while, lived a little bit on the New York side of the Hudson for a bit, but he really stayed up in this region. He was part of the Hudson School of Painters.
Bruce, can I make a comment here?
I'm sorry?
Can I make a comment here?
Oh, absolutely.
I look at this style of photography or painting, if you will, in direct contrast to, say, someone like an illustrator like Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell was total detail. This is almost an illusion.
Right.
And, but both of them are very satisfying.
But David, it goes to the question of, for each of us, what are we looking to create?
Right.
Take a picture.
Exactly.
Are we a documentary type of person? And that doesn't necessarily mean going out and, shooting for newspapers or major social events. It could be, taking great family pictures, and recording histories of the family, which themselves are extraordinarily important, especially in today's age of everything digital. Actually, printing some of that stuff will prove extremely valuable in the future, when your children and grandchildren are looking at all this stuff. So I found myself being more to the, I mean, I shoot, some of my photography is quite specific, quite obvious as to what it is, but almost all of it is done with reference to certain styles of either painting, always of paintings, other photographers certainly, share a few of those with you later, but it becomes a reference point on which for me to build a concept as I create my photographs. The last one of Inness's that I thought I would share was a daytime picture. And the texture in his sky, the softness in the marshes and such here, I think this is the one that is from Montclair, New Jersey. And I think that's his house, that little white spot in the, in this section of the image. He painted everything, but it was really a suggested shape. It was almost like an impressionist.
Exactly.
It was almost a precursor to the impressionist movement. And with some of my work, this plays a significant role. Some of the detail, some of the work I do is very detailed, very obvious, as you'll see in the moment. And other portions of it are far less specific, far softer. As some of you know, as you all know, probably know, I don't care if I have grain in my images. I don't care if some of my images are soft focus or even blurred to a degree. It's just, I don't lose any sleep over that. This one image, this is one of mine. And what is the only part of this that's particularly important is when I go out, this was the original image, which I'm pretty confident we can all agree is pretty much a big nothing. It's dull, it's flat, it's really not an appealing snapshot. But when I go out to photograph, I photograph with a sense of some of the art forms that I have previously referred to and other painters or photographers. And I go with a concept in mind. When I go out into the, now it's been a few years like this, into the woods, or even to take a walk, I happen to have the camera with me, it's these patterns, it's these details in this image that appeal to me. I don't terribly care about the color, though I will always follow my normal routine, that curves tool to color correct a little bit. And as you can see here on the right side of the page, I do all that luminosity masking. But that doesn't really matter to me because I knew that this image was going to first convert to a sepia tone type image through the black and white module, which is easily done in Photoshop. And then I dodged and burned so that the only thing that was left was all of this maze of vine and God knows what other invasive species on that piece of landscape. It's almost this abstract that I start to look for when I'm out with the camera. And I do this because I happen to like the abstract form of art. I happen to like the other styles of painting, one of which I've already shared with you. I look at these as a way, I look at my camera almost as a sketch pad on which to create just a concept or an idea that when I get back to Photoshop, in my case, Photoshop, I can work with. And it will take time, a little bit of hunting and pecking and then sitting and letting it just simmer for a while. I'll come back to it and then decide how to finish it. But this was the result of that first image. Another image, this one's pretty straight. It's a nice scene, not terribly far from the house. It certainly turned out, I don't have the full size, this is just a compressed JPEG that I loaded for Instagram, but it wasn't very complicated. It was just basically converting it to a sepia tone, as you see, and then very slowly, section by section, dodging and burning in Photoshop. Nothing fancy, bringing out the brights, highlighting some of the shadow detail, et cetera, until I got that look and feel that I wanted to record.
You know, it's weird. Where I can't see. There you are. the you're saying sepia, and I'm actually seeing like a greenish cast on just the grass and stuff. And I wonder, are people seeing?
I don't see it on my screen.
It's
There is
very,
a bit of a
pretty.
yellowish cast.
It's
I will
green on
admit
my
that,
screen too.
Yeah, I have green grass too.
oh, it's a little bit yellowish in mine. That could be the case because I mean, I see it there. But again, it comes down, this is a two-part problem. And it's maybe a great point to bring up. I do all of my processing in ProPhoto. You know, it's a very large color space, which you've heard me talk about before. But then when I convert my images to JPEGs for purposes of sharing on Instagram, the conversion takes place so that it's an RGB color space. And as we've discussed before, when you go from a broader color spectrum, whether it's Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB or any of the few others that are possible, which are very broad color spaces, and you go down to a much more restricted color space, there will be some color shifting. So again, depending upon how your monitors are profiled versus my monitor, versus how that will also govern how the color shift reflects itself on your screen. But it was an interesting comment, Donna, because it relates to that transition from a broader color space to a more restricted color space that I use, that most of us will use when we post to Instagram or Facebook, so that you can, or any web space, so that you can, you will see some color shifts. And that's why you have to look very carefully at the image, Donna, to make sure that after you've done the conversion, you don't have to go back and tidy it up a little bit, whether it be sharpness a little bit, if that's important, or color correction, if that's required because of the shift from one color space to another. So great question, thank you.
And hey, Bruce.
Yes, sir.
Would I be right in guessing, okay, you said ProPhoto
Yep.
was your color space? Do you use that pretty much because it fits better with the printer and what it's capable of?
No, it's not so much the printer, John. It's if you can recall that session that I did last year, each time you go from one color space up a standard, whether it's from RGB up to Adobe RGB or up to ProPhoto or a couple of the others, each time you expand the color gamut that the space you have, you're now growing into the next space. What you add are the colors such as the brighter yellows, the brighter blues, the brighter greens and such. So when I print, on some of my prints where vibrant color is required, that makes a big difference for me. The unfortunate part of it also, it adds to file size, but I'm less concerned about that because of the hard drives. But I do use ProPhoto because the printer will see, you know, the printer doesn't care what my monitor is, which my monitor is only an RGB monitor. One day I'll break down and get a more refined monitor, but a bigger color space monitor. But right now it works fine because I know what to expect out of my printer. And where the color shifts take place, I know why they're taking place, so I'm okay. But the reason I use ProPhoto is the broader color space on the more vibrant colors.
Okay.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay. Shifting gears here, this is the last image that I will share with you. This is one of mine, and it obviously takes strong reference to some of the Inness paintings.
Very much.
Very soft. And once again, though I kind of thought I saw a good platform on which to work when I took the photograph, but as I'm working in Photoshop, because I go baby step by baby step in my processing, I don't do very broad changes unless it's going from color to a black and white type. I go very, very softly because for me, the way I see things, it's as the processing develops, I begin to see points that, okay, now I know where the image is likely going to end up because I have this study of the other artists under my belt and I have reference points on which to base what I think this final image might look like. That'll never be the same as a painting by any stretch, but it will
Oh,
be.
beautiful.
Thank you very much.
I
But
lost the picture
it,
somehow.
I beg your pardon?
I lost the picture.
Oh.
It says launching meeting. I still see you guys, but my picture's gone. When I looked at the picture you got there.
Is everybody else seeing my monitor?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Should I log out? Should I go out and come back in?
Yeah, sure. We won't go too far. Exit out and come back. We'll see what happens.
Okay, wait a minute.
You know, that's why one of the reasons I do a fair amount of the study of these other artists, because they add to the foundation on which I can do my own work. It becomes something for me that I have found extremely valuable because I do not have an art background. I'm an accountant, as you all know, by training. And I focused throughout my education on accounting related courses. And I avoided anything else that really didn't relate to what I thought my career path was going to be. Not always the smartest move, but needless to say, these last few years, I've had a lot of free time on my hands. So I've picked up the study that I once never did. So this is how some of my work turns out. Linda, I still have your face on the screen. Is your computer live?
It is. I can hear you. And if I push this thing in the right corner, I can see the picture you're talking about, but it's really, really little. And now the faces go away. I don't know what's up with it. You know, my computer's messed up. Just keep going. I'll get it back.
So the next thing I want to do, this is the last piece. And it's a very simple piece. It's a photograph of these 5 trees out on Route 41, just on the Connecticut side of the border. And my intention all along was to keep it as simple as possible. I've been staring at these goddamn trees now for the better part of 14 years, not knowing what to do. And I finally, my 300 millimeter finally came back from the shop, nice and happy, and I snapped the picture, brought it home, and basically masked out everything but these 5 trees and some of the shadows. Obviously, the more I look at it, the more aggravated I get with the picture because I realize I haven't left all of the shadows in there. But
yeah, I was just going to mention that.
Artistic, license, I guess. It's really very depressing because otherwise it wouldn't be a bad picture. But what I did then was, after I cleaned everything out, in past history, there were types of photography such as tintype. And if there are textures that we can buy out there, which are modeled after the tintype process. And I had a pretty good idea going into this shot that I was going to attempt to do that. But I wasn't certain until I started putting texture to, screen, if you will. And it ultimately turned out the way I wanted to. The unfortunate part, of course, I have to go back now and unmask those shadows, but nonetheless, that so again, this is referenced to with reference to a prior photographic style. Okay, totally different space. Let's just get centered here for a second and go back. Good. We are looking at Chinese pen and ink drawing paintings. Now, I have no skill when it comes to painting. I aspire, I would love to be able to do that, but the odds of it happening in this lifetime or the next are limited. But looking at the way these artists applied the ink with their brushes, I find striking. What's more is that texture that you see behind the bird is the paper. You know, the artists in a time gone by in Asia, the paper was as much of an art form as the work on which it was, you know, that was painted onto it. So this texture is what, when I'm studying this texture is what got me involved in starting to use some of those Japanese papers that I've mentioned to you. So I look at this, the writing that you see apparently sometimes was added with the making of the painting, sometimes added years subsequent to the making of the painting, and it had to do with the people that looked at it. And there's a whole history to the writing that goes on some of these.
Yeah, the writing is as interesting as the painting.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
It's really interesting how the writing itself takes place, and you can see that little red stamp on it. That is sometimes the artist's personal stamp, sometimes people who have reviewed the work, their stamp. It just goes from, you know, from one extreme to the next. But this became fascinating to me as I watched it, because as I studied them, because of the simplicity of it. You know, no color but for that stamp. But look at the way the blacks here with handmade ink, you know, rubbed on a stone into water. Look at the lovely texture in those blacks that they were able to achieve. So it always gives me ideas as to how I might apply textures, colors, whatever in my work. More on that will come up in a bit. This is an image that I copied off of. All of these images are downloaded from Google. Thank God for Google. I just love the style. I love the color palette. You know, you can see on the top here the blossoms, all quite lovely. And as of course they're falling off the tree in a particular style to Japanese artists of the age. But this on the right side here, the color palette that was used for the making of this particular woodblock print, I find very valuable, and I've taken to saving these color palettes so that if I go into some, you know, flight of fancy on one of my own images, I might be able to refer back to these colors and either add with subtle paint strokes, etc., some texture, some color, some hint of color to some of my work. So I found this particular piece on Google particularly helpful. I enjoyed that. The next part of it is, this is again a paint and or watercolor and pen and brush drawing. And if you look at how delicate all of those, sorry, I'll get this thing down, it's too big and annoying. Look at how delicately they applied the wash in the leaves. And you realize as we do some of our work, as you do some of the dodging and burning that we might be able to do in some of our work, if you think about how these artists apply their wash, how delicately, to a very delicate paper.
You can emulate that with your dodging and burning.
Exactly. You know, you could really you could really move in some wonderful ways. I'm fascinated by, just by dabbing the brush, what they did. And we could do that exactly this, well, electronically in much the same way. And there are people who do paint via Photoshop to achieve similar results. So I thought I would share this one with you. Sorry. Chinese work. I mean, just the brushwork is remarkable. To take a look at what they've done here. You'll notice there's no edges, or there are very few edges to these leaves. It's referred to as a boneless painting. If you think about how we would stand if we did not have a spine in our back,
Right.
they have done this boneless style.
It's implied.
Rubbing the brush in a certain way. I guess, Linda, you'd have a better sense of what takes place than I certainly do, but it's something that I just find fascinating. And once again, it becomes a reference point for some of those blending techniques that I have employed in some of my other work, some of which I'll share with you in a bit. So this
It's
was
like, I'm sorry. It's like they imply, you look at the stems that are missing, they're implying that they're there, and your mind makes the connection.
Right.
Yeah.
It's all, much of it is suggested, especially on that, on the right, for me, the right side of the page. It's really very fascinating to see what they did. And again, for the kind of work that I do, it becomes a reference point for whatever other dodging and burning skills I've chosen to learn over these years.
Yep.
Another, same type. I thought I would just share this to you because I saw these edges on these leaves and these colors in the flowers, just striking. And you'll notice there the color that you see here underneath these underneath the plants has to do with the photograph and how the light shined on the photograph. You can see a little bit of a dark area down here. I guess the paper curled. Some of these papers are, the backgrounds are not painted on, so they are image only. And it's just the texture of the paper that you're seeing, whatever tone the texture of the paper actually had, which I've thought about doing, and I've done on one or two. The jury's out on whether they're worth anything, worth sharing. So woodblock print, wonderful colors. How to consider the colors that I might use in some of my work. I've actually copied those colors. If you take a look in the upper corner of my monitor here, let's go to my colors. My type. You can see these colors on the upper right corner. I have literally copied those colors from this and a few of the other images that you're about to see, because they serve as interesting backgrounds as I begin to do some of my other work, along with blending techniques that we've talked about in a prior class, prior session. This is a totally different style of photography. This is a photograph. This is a photograph that was covered with a wax called encaustic painting. And with a brush, the artist has applied, you can almost see that there's a thick layer of something over the actual image. And it is that layer of wax that she has laid over it. And it causes itself a blend. The wax itself causes a bit of a blending of the color. And if you will, a bit of a softness to the entire image, a bit of a smearing effect. I've found this, I certainly can't replicate that digitally, at least not yet. I've been trying to with zero success. But the concept of the texture that the brush leaves as it applies the wax, which is typically a hot wax or warmed wax, sometimes even further warmed with a gently applied blowtorch. The brushing of the wax itself leaves a texture that for some of my work I've used. And this, by the way, is done by, interestingly enough, a local artist. Let's stick with where I was. No. Oh, didn't go far enough. Sorry. Let's go right down to here. Okay. This artist, who I just realized this evening, she's got a show right up in Connecticut, not far from here at the present time. This is a photograph. And she works, this is not a covered, this is no texture covered to this. This is just a color palette that she applies to her work. And if you refer back to some of the Japanese and Chinese artists that I showed just a bit ago, there's a definite similarity in the softness and the simplicity of the work that she has created. And this is photography. This is pure, straight photography, I'm sure via Photoshop. Okay. Another one of her pieces, no, that's mine, too late, forget that.
I like that one.
Yeah, we'll go back to that in a second. This is one of her works. This is one of her encaustics. And, you know, clearly there's a tree line back there someplace. Maybe there's some water up here. Looks like there's some reflections in this lower third, but she has covered it with a wax. And it's that texture of how she's applied the wax to the image that contributes, in my view, greatly to what the image says to me. I mean, without all that wax texture, blurring of the color from the inks, it would be a very different photograph for me, right? This is a pretty straight photograph.
Oh, I've been there. I love that play.
I did this one to, you know, remind you of a trip not taken this summer. But if you'll notice, the grass, and I'll make this larger, these trees are not sharp. This grass is not sharp. Some of the stones are a bit blurry. You're getting some sharpness up in the windows or the slits in the castle. And I did that to, one, show the beauty of her work and its very subdued tones, the softness that she's sharing with us, but also, who cares if the message that you're attempting to share with your photograph isn't a knife-edged, rigid, you know, totally square image. Yep. There's a beauty to this. And for my eye, again, everything is in art is quite personal. For me, I find this terribly appealing. Okay. Another one of her encaustics, very lovely to look at. I just, the texture in it, the colors, the color palette is just a treat to share. Okay. A gate. I think some of the leaves up here are in shape. You'll note, I don't know whether she did this blurring in post-production or through the action of her zoom lens. But we have a doorway here. And this was her interpretation of how to share a doorway. Beautiful scene. You may or may not like the blurring, but it is certainly a very different way to suggest something mysterious, for some people possibly ominous. And I'm not sure.
I don't think it would be as interesting if it were totally in focus. I think it's better this way.
I do too.
Yeah,
I like it.
yeah,
Okay.
I agree.
Thank you. And that was the point I was attempting to share. Not everything needs to be in focus. There is an imagination, a mystery, a dream, or whatever you might be going through your head that you might find the better approach in your making or processing of this image so that you get a kind of an image that means more to you. And whether you just like it better or there's a different meaning in it for you. But the goal is when someone looks at your work, force them to stop for a moment before they move on to the next piece and think about what's here. What am I thinking about? Okay, next. I think this is a fence. I can't be quite certain. My first view of it was a waterfall, but I see now on closer examination, I'm clearly wrong.
Tree.
It must be a fence, tree. There you go, tree with some moss. You know,
With the vines also.
I shared it because I really like the tonality
I
of
can
the
plainly
picture,
see it's a garden
right?
because it
And
says
it's
on the bottom, forgotten garden.
okay, well, thank you. Shows you how my bifocals are working. But the goal here is if it were done totally crisp, totally straight, it would be a magnificently different image than the one we see in front of us. Which do you prefer? Totally personal. It's just a way that things can be shown differently to achieve whatever message that you're attempting to achieve. We're back to that first image. Okay, now we'll go back to some of mine. Good. Get out of there. JPEG, here we go. This is a very simple image. I put some texture behind it. I'm not sure that I totally love the image, but it's still a work in process. But this, get
Did
this
I know
down.
you go down and just click them like that?
Oh, I just run my mouse
I
down
did not know that I had to click every one. Now I learned something.
No, just run them down. This is the original image. And again, I knew, and this happens to be some plants Ellen has in the backyard, at least the small things with the thin branches. And then there's woods behind us. But I knew when I took the picture, it was this detail that I'm running my cursor over. I knew that that's what I wanted. So again, thinking back to the style of some of those early Chinese and Japanese artists, I then proceeded to, lose my mind, sorry, get rid of this, and eliminate through some detailed levels of masking everything but those vines and leaves that I wanted to retain. I then continued to add texture, again, with reference to some of the paper textures and colors that I found in other Japanese images, Chinese and Japanese images. And just for reference, this is a sheet of ice that I photographed a couple years ago on that terribly cold winter we had. It was a pour over from on a side of a hill, over some stone. I photographed the image and I kept it because I knew one day it would prove of use to me. And it finally has. I can see now where I'll use it probably as a background texture for other work that I do. So it's just, whoops. So it's just a matter of keeping all of this work together so that you ultimately you derive something that meets your eye. And again, with reference to things that I've studied in the past. Okay.
Oh, beautiful.
Thank
That's
you.
Beautiful. That is beautiful. Just
Thank
like
you.
that.
Did this one last week on a walk. I found the image is wandering. I'm like a bobblehead doll as I go through the neighborhood, looking for work. This is the original image. Oop, I've got one thing highlighted, beg your pardon. This is the original image. What struck me as I was staring at the cloudless sky are these branches, you know? Look at the story that's in these things. You know, they twist and bend, and they have their various colors reflected in the obviously against a bright sky. I don't know what kind of tree it is. I'll be the last one to ask. But the more I looked at them, the more I realized there was something there for me to work with. Originally, I thought I was going to keep this section in the lower left corner. And I had a desire that said maybe I would keep all of this individual detail in all of these spiny little viney things that were going along. Well, I tried that and I didn't like it. I kept in this upper corner, but ultimately I changed. And again, here's where the work began. Trying to add texture and color. You see these lines that are going kind of top to bottom?
Yeah.
That's the brushstroke in the wax. Okay? It's an encaustic texture. So it is literally the brushstroke of the wax. Now, mind you, there's also the added texture below it that I previously included, but the last step was to apply that encaustic brushstroke to get that feeling that I thought I wanted. I then add in the first level of what I think is going to be, and you'll see here on the right side, I have all those blend if options, you know, and blending options highlighted. As a matter of fact, I'm using a multiply blending mode right up here. And in this level, again, also it's normal, but I am blending all over the place to finally get what you're seeing here. Again, there's a strong reference back to some of the Japanese and Chinese painters. And then needless to say, the encaustic style of art, which I happen to appreciate greatly. So everything I've tried to, you know, at least open to you in the prior conversations, I use regularly. Not necessarily in every image, because every image doesn't call for it, but in those images where I begin to see something, and I apply them step by step, going through it. I mean, right up to and including here, this topmost level here, that's a smart object. So that's why everything here is added below, and all the blending takes place below the actual subject image, but I did it with a smart object. The reason for that had to do with how I wanted to bring in other textures and other color, a little bit of a softening of the greens in this image.
And Bruce, can I ask you a question? How do you get the tree out? You know?
Oh, hello, Ning. How are
Hi,
you?
sorry, I'm late. I just want to walk in.
Turn
And
on
I
your
should-
camera. You're hidden from view. How did I get the texture? Okay.
Anyway, how do you get out? Because your original the picture with the mountain, you know. So I know
Well,
if you
take,
get out something, it gradually, but
yes,
the whole area.
always
How do you,
gradually. So let's go back to the beginning on this picture, okay? We'll start from scratch. Here is the picture
yes,
right
yes,
out of the camera.
yes.
I did a little bit of color correction, which I always do on every image, because the sky wasn't this blue when I looked at it. And I did not have any filter on my camera. It's just, it was I exposed the image intentionally a little bit on the dark side because I wanted to be sure that I had the details in this branch. The texture of Mother Nature's branches, I wanted to be sure I retained, okay?
Yes.
So what I then did was I color corrected a little bit. I retained all of my texture, but my sky is now closer to what it was, it was like, I don't know, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a bright sunny day a few weekends ago. So everything was just bright, you know, it was just big yellow sun in the top of in the skies. I then did a little bit of sharpening, just very little bit. And then my next step was this. You'll notice I'm skipping something here on the right. I went in and I masked everything. Okay. This mask.
Yeah. How do you get this step? How do you get this step?
With about 6 hours of masking.
Oh, geez.
Oh.
5, 6 hours of masking. The good part of being quarantined, if I have no pressure to go anyplace else.
Lucky for
Oh, there was a
you.
lot I was going to get done in Photoshop when I was quarantined. I haven't started yet.
Well,
I got to start.
I've lost my sanity is what I can say. So I did this all in Photoshop, and that's a separate conversation. I'm happy to show it to you afterwards or at a different time, but
Sure.
it's real work, okay? So
Wow.
that's what I began to do, okay? Then I added a couple more of these layers to just finish off. Again, Ning, I'm going to repeat everybody. I'm going to repeat myself because I'm not sure exactly where Ning came in. So
No, I already saw this.
Okay, good. Now
I saw the Japanese.
What I did then is I brought back in. I brought back in first this piece. Okay, and you'll see in the mask here, I took out those branches that once were in the lower left corner.
Mhm.
I will put masks in as liberally as I need to. Fortunately, this mask was basically taking out a big brush of black and just, on the mask, just making it go away. Took about 2 seconds to do. But clearly this image, it's missing. For my eye, it was missing something. What I've begun doing on many of my images, I've begun adding back things that I have masked.
Okay.
Okay, so this layer, if I were to disable this mask for the moment and kill this, this is, well, you can't do it because everything is, there's all those textures there. This is the original image, okay? Except no sky. Actually, not a lot of sky anyway. There's a little bit of blue up there. But once I put in this mask, enable mask, and I add back in all of what I wanted to include, this was the level that I had wanted, I am bringing this in. You can see I have multiply here, and I have begun in this. We had talked in a prior conversation about this blend if mode, and I had suggested to you that you could work with pure grayscale, as you can see I have, where I blend certain things out, make certain things more obvious, etc. Or you could work with colors. And my goal here, you see how that color began to come back in down below? I didn't want the greens in this masked image to be so prevalent. I wanted those greens to fade out. So I split this right cursor and I began to just drag it to the left until my greens fade out. And if I had to, I went even more on the bottom layer. So let's take this down and this goes back. And that's how I get a suggestion of my underlying layer in the way that I have. So let's just cancel this. I go back to the way it was. That is, Ning, how I got the suggestion of what was in this original layer back into. This is mountains and scrub and trees. But I decided that this was the wrong spot for me because I did not like all of these thin branches up in this upper left corner. So I copied this first layer, delete this, and then I put another mask in. And I deleted some things that I just didn't want to see. I added a camera raw filter in here. Again, this is now a smart object. I added a camera raw filter and I added another level of texture. The exact same level of texture I used down here, I applied a second time as an overlay on top of my branches. And that's how I got the look and feel. So once again, going back to some of this. Ning, how did you get in when I was sharing some of the Japanese and Chinese pictures?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so you've
I
been in
saw
for a while. So with those pictures and with the study of that work as a reference point, combining with all the other styles that I have chosen to study and follow, created this image. And that's how it comes about. And it's a bit of a thinking process for me. And it, needless to say, sucks up huge chunks of my time. But then again, I'm not going anyplace else in a big rush these days, so it's okay. And it keeps me sane. And I must admit, over the last 2 months, my Photoshop skills have skyrocketed.
Mm-hmm.
The last image that I'd like to share is this one.
Oh, yes.
Okay, this image is this. This was the original image.
I was thinking it was cabbage.
Right?
It's a rose.
I added a texture. Basically, this is the texture, and it comes from, if you go up to Windows in Photoshop, and you go down to extensions, and you see what I'm highlighting here, Adobe Paper Texture Pro.
Mm-hmm.
It's free textures from Adobe, called Adobe Paper Texture Pro. Once again, forget that. Where am I? Okay, mouse. Once again, it is, okay. All of a sudden my mouse went, there we go. Now we're better. Window, extensions, Adobe Paper Texture Pro. And you get all of these textures. It will show up on a blue box right here, but I have found that I like using them differently. So
Oh, yeah.
I copied them into a library, and you can see them all here. I find that they're bigger for me to see. The thumbnails on that blue button are small, so I can't really see the texture well as I go in and I select which texture I choose to apply. But that's all that this is. This is a texture. I then went in and I applied a small curves layer, and I made this texture ever so dark, ever so slightly more contrasty. As you can see down here, I applied a texture mask. I applied a mask. Okay, it's light right now because it's not fully applied. So this is the original. There's got some, I've added, excuse me, I've blended it out a bit through, once again, using my blend if mode. I share with you everything I use myself. So using the grayscale up here in the blend if mode, I have changed my darks and my lights, and that texture is now all back to the way it was. Okay, so by using the blend if mode, I get this look and feel. Okay, I wanted that because below it, I have added these textures from the library palette from up top. This texture now comes in, and I copy this layer up to here, And now all of my textures are below. This is a lovely image, except it really is not going anyplace by itself. I throw in a curves tool. You'll see this little downward arrow. This downward arrow, which if you apply any of the adjustment layers, would be right here. It creates a clipping mask. It clips this adjustment directly to the layer immediately below. I did the same once again up here. This is just as it is, okay? It's clipped below, I've darkened things. But now I've blended all of this together, all of these levels together to come up here. And the last step was I brightened this just a bit, okay? And I've messed around with some of my layers, so it's not getting the vibrance that it had before. But you can, this came out much brighter and obviously far more vibrant than when I fooled with it before. Should it come out too dark for you, it's really quite simple. Clipping mask, make your color, careful what you do. You know, you can, take this out. You can open up your midtones. See what's happening? Just by using your curves tool, brightening it just a little bit on the dark side, but going to midtones, right? So right in the center, and then you can brighten this a little bit more to achieve whatever look and feel you so choose. Take this down so it doesn't bang. And that's at this stage what I would share with you. If you want to stick around for more, there's always a few more to do. God knows there's a library at this stage of things to share. I mean, for example, back up. I've got to bring up my, here we go. Come on. Yeah, I'm going to move you out of the way. Fine. Here I am, bring this up, Instagram. Here's one. This, I think I showed you once before. Oh, here's, this one's better. This, it's just a very simple picture. It didn't really take very much to do, but it's reminiscent of some of that Asian work that I shared with you earlier. And through blending, and obviously you can see I'm beginning to bring back, you can see here a plant. Well, I didn't want that plant in the original image. By slowly blending that plant in with just a percentage of its original power, I have now the original image back as part of this, along with some textures of red highlights as are part of the plant.
Hey, Bruce.
Yes, sir.
Don't mean to interrupt, but I'm seeing the same flower you had before. Did you?
Oh, wait a second. I beg your pardon. Wait. Sorry. I always make that mistake.
Thank you, John.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, I didn't want to say anything in case I was wrong.
Okay, I'm rolling along. I keep forgetting that I have
this
to
is
share additional
beautiful.
screens.
Yes, it is.
It's a little
This
different.
is, it's as simple as you want to ask for, but clearly, as you can see, I'll repeat myself because I tried to confuse you a moment ago. On this side of the page, on the left side of my screen here, you can see the outline of more plants. You can see up here in this upper right corner, the
Yes.
outline of more plants.
Yes.
I originally masked down all of the rest of this stuff, leaving just this primary subject. You see my cursor running over. And then I applied some background, you know, some texture, and slowly using the blend if function, you can see that the flower, the white of this flower, what is this? This is not a forsythia. One of you people who knows flowers should help me out here. Maybe a maple tree, not a maple tree.
This is
Something.
magnolia.
Thank you very much.
Magnolia.
Okay, thank you very much. Obviously, these are white. But because of the blending technique in the Blend If tool, I made the white fade out, bringing out the underneath texture with only the red staying in place. I blended out my brights and I left in my darks, the power of the Blend If tool. Now, for you painters in the crowd, you could do this with your brush. I'm limited. I don't paint. So I'm fooling around with stuff that's digital. Okay. And that's what I choose. That's what I'm working on. Uh, Building on a background that's recently acquired in these other art forms.
Very good.
Really pretty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Very
pretty.
nice.
Very pretty.
So,
Like a painting.
I'm sorry?
Like a painting, like a Chinese painting.
Yeah, something like that. I wouldn't put too much of a bet on that, but I'm someplace in the same ballpark anyway. But it's studying again, because I didn't do any of this study in my high school or college days. I found that when I was sick and couldn't do much else, and now in the years what I can do, and I have a reference point, finding these art forms has been magnificent. And I've added some books to my personal library, which have painters both, from hundreds of years ago, through the creation of the beautiful fans, the screens, and again, just the original black ink and pen drawing and brush drawings. But it's a whole new thing. And what is it? It was Van Gogh apparently relied heavily on some of the styles, some of the paintings that he had seen when the China trade had opened up and Chinese paintings were coming and woodblock prints were coming into Europe. He began relying upon them for some of the styles that he used in his own work. And thus the art form began to get absorbed into some Western painting styles. So it was very interesting about how China, and then actually even Japan and the combined Korea, they absorbed as trade opened up within the Asian seas. Fascinating to read about, and very useful what I'm doing now.
Well, I have to get running, but nice seeing you all. See y'all again.
Well, I'm done
Bye, Donna.
actually.
Much, Bruce.
Bye, Donna.
Very
Unless
good.
anybody has any other questions, I've run the limit on what I wanted to share.
Yeah, I'm gonna break it up too, because this is beautiful. I got a
Thank
couple.
you, Bruce.
You're quite welcome. I thought something a little bit different, a little bit of Photoshop, but a lot of everything else.
Are we gonna do something next Tuesday?
Well, this was
I thought
not
last
planned.
week.
No,
I
I
thought
just,
last week we were done.
no, I just want to know how do you just get this piece of the flower out, then blending with the texture. So you say
Hi
6
guys.
hours. So I have you say you have to be little by little, little by little. How do you do that? If I only have 2 hours each time, so I can do partially and save and next
You
day.
can do all of this. You can do everything. If you want to, on a side, we can do another Zoom meeting. We'll take one of your pieces and I'll show you one of your photographs and I'll show you how to do it.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's time consuming, but
It just show me how to do, because usually say, for example, if a beautiful girl in a garden and they just put out her and mix it with other thing. And I know that, but I think the flower and the tree, because so many details. So I just wondering how to do, because you can say quickly select. If you can use a quickly select for people, maybe easy, but a flower, especially the tree you showed before, all the small stitches, how do you?
well, for example, okay, everybody knows that every layer in an adjustment panel has a properties associated with it, right? We're all familiar with that.
Not me.
You can.
You
We're all
and me
familiar with
both,
that
Dave.
now. We're all familiar with that now. If you go into your properties panel, you can change things, okay? Well, I'm going to make a copy of this layer. Oops, there we go. And you'll notice that my properties panel has changed. And in the properties panel, there are now 2 quick actions on the bottom of the screen, right? You see where I'm circling my cursor?
Yeah.
One of says remove background. So I'm going to make the first layer go away so there's no thing. Remove background.
Oh,
If
oh.
you, wait a second, if you give Photoshop a moment, it will search out the subject that it thinks. Now, the problem with this image, and you see it's created a mask for you. So you could go back in and you see the density of the mask? If I take the density down to, let's say, 50%, you see the entire image that it masked out. But it'll also give you a hint that if you now want to make a change with your black brush, sorry, make this smaller. No, it doesn't really matter, actually. You see, if I paint things back in,
Yes.
I can change my mask to bring back everything that I had just masked out. The problem with Photoshop is in an image like this, where there is so much detail, it's hard for Photoshop to find the subject. So you could, in an image such as trees and flowers and branches, very difficult. If I were to do the same thing, but in this case, hit subject, it'll take a second. As you can see, the artificial intelligence will go. And once again, it went. You see the marching ants up here?
Yes.
Once again, because those places were blended, were basically their original intensity of color and shape, that was the only thing that Photoshop felt it could latch onto. So you can't really do a select subject or remove background tool. And I remind you, should you use a remove background, that is a permanent destructive edit. If you use remove background, make sure the first thing you do is create a background that you don't kill off.
If you made a copy, you're not
And
destructive.
that's why I made a layer 1 here. So if I made a glaring error, at the very least, I could go back and start over.
Right.
Okay, so that's just a head up. Trust me, I've made more than one mistake to justify that belief. Okay, anything else I can answer for this session?
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
This
you.
is what I do in Photoshop. This is what I'm looking to create in my image making. Some of it, as I showed you earlier, is very straight landscape. Don't do a lot of people. But others of it are more of what I see in my head than what I see in front of me. And sometimes what I see in my head's entertaining. Thank you for laughing.
You entertain yourself in your head.
More often than not.
That was great, Bruce. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you very much.